do? It was our first constitution. What else?
It united the colonies.
United the colonies into a country.
It wasn't like so strict that the states would rebel against.
Exactly. It brought them together, but not so strict that the states could retain some autonomy, in fact, a great deal of autonomy. It preserved their liberties that they had fought for in the American Revolution. It also organized the Western land. That's its biggest strength. The Treaty of Paris gave them not just the land of the original 13 colonies, but gave them all the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. And all that was organized very successfully by the central government under the Articles. We'll talk about that. Its weaknesses were what?
There's like no federal power at
No
all.
central power, could not tax, could not regulate commerce, so every state was cutting the tariff against the other state. Couldn't tax the states, could only ask for taxes, it could raise an army, but it couldn't pay for the army. It couldn't have a cohesive foreign policy, so every state had its own Secretary of State and its own treaty-making ability. So it really was in many ways 13 independent countries. Under the organization of the Western lands, please know those two bills, the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance. The Land Ordinance basically divided each township into 36 square mile areas, and sold the land for a certain amount of money. So it raised money for the new central government by selling the land. And what was in the central plot of each township, remember?
A school.
A schools, yeah, it set aside land for schools. What was the Northwest Ordinance?
The path for statehood.
Right, it set up a three-stage path to statehood. Okay, after so many members, you got a constitution, a legislature, etc. So it created a path to statehood and created the precedent that we have today that any territory owned by the United States will be given the opportunity to apply for full and equal statehood. And that's how Hawaii, and that's how Alaska, and how even Guam and Puerto Rico have the right to ask for statehood if they want it. And as I said, Guam is moving in the opposite direction. I think they're going to want full independence, and Puerto Rico is more in the direction of statehood. Okay, period of trial. The Articles, basically, the greatest single event that led to the rejection of the Articles was Shays' Rebellion. It showed the weakness of the central government in putting down a rebellion. That led to the Constitution. There are three of the great compromises at the convention. The AP people love to ask questions about 19th century compromise, so please know all your compromises, starting with these three. The Great Compromise, which was between the large states and the small states. What was it?
Got a Senate and a House of Representatives.
The Senate represented the small states, because every state was equal, and the House represented the large states, because big states had more congressmen than small states. So if you go to the population map I have in the back, you'll see it's still true today. California has 53 congressmen, and Wyoming has 1. So the big states have more power in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, all the states are equal. Yeah, they're all equal in power. Okay. Then there's the 3/5 compromise. You know about the slave trade, which ended the slave trade by 1808. Who were Federalists and Anti-Federalists?
People that supported the Constitution, and people who didn't support
Exactly. And they're not political parties. Please don't make that mistake. They're factions that grew up to oppose passage of the Constitution and to favor it. List somebody famous who favored the Constitution.
Jefferson.
Jefferson was not in the country. He was the minister to France, and he had neither position. Who were the authors of the Federalist Papers? They supported the Constitution.
Hamilton?
Hamilton,
Jay.
and Madison.
Yes.
Those are your big. In fact, Madison is called the father of the Constitution. He's by far the most prominent Federalist supporting the creation of a Constitution. Anti-Federalists include Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, and other great ones who didn't like the new strong central government. So the Federalist Papers, as is listed there, were written by Jay, Hamilton, and Madison as a means of arguing in favor of the Constitution in New York when they had their convention. Okay? Look at the 6 principles of the Constitution, including federalism. One principle is written, to federalism. What principle, what does that mean, federalism? Say the Constitution contains the principle of federalism. What does that mean?
Stronger central government?
Not exactly. You'll know this next year for sure. I beat it into the APUSH kids. I call it the magic F word. Listen, never forget the F word. You look at it, federalism. Okay, federalism is the balance between the central government and the state governments. That in our country, we don't have a dominant central government or a dominant state government. Under the Articles of Confederation, states were dominant. In parliamentary governments like England and France, central governments dominate. In the United States, we have a balance. Some powers the federal government have, other powers state governments have, other powers they share in common. So that's what's called a federal system. Checks and balances, meaning the three branches can check each other. Limited government means the central government can only do what the Constitution says. It's limited by the Constitution. National judiciary, meaning we have a system of courts to interpret the Constitution. And national supremacy means that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Okay, let's take a look at the Federalist era. George Washington was our first president. Basically, his first term was dominated by Hamilton's financial plan and getting the finances and credit corrected, getting it fixed. And the second term basically was dominated by the French Revolution that broke out in 1789. So in his first term, Hamilton's financial plan basically involved 4 parts. Anybody remember what the 4 parts of his plan were?
A national bank,
A national bank, that's the big one you should always remember, right?
tariff,
Okay, a tariff and a whiskey tax to raise money.
to always incur debt.
Okay, good, to fund the debt, meaning not always incur debt, but to pay off the previous government's debt in its entirety. And the 4th, to assume the state debts into the federal government. In other words, allow the federal government to have all the debt and take away the debt from the states. Okay, so that 4-part plan, supported by the tariff and whiskey tax that we're going to be raising money to pay it off, allowed Hamilton to establish credit. Why is establishing good credit so important?
So then the people care about what the government does.
People care, they want to make sure you succeed, and if they know you're going to succeed, they're more likely to lend you money, buy your bonds and lend you money. That's important. None of you would be living in a house right now if your parents didn't have good credit. I mean, unless your parents have $1 million, $1.5 million lying around to buy a house. So typically when your parents buy a house, what do?
To get a loan.
They get a loan. Who gives them money? Who's crazy enough to give your parents a loan? The bank. Why would the bank do that?
Because we have good credit.
How do they get good credit?
They always
Paying
pay
off their
their
debts.
They always pay their debts. They have good cash flow to pay their debts. So when you get good credit, you can buy way more valuable things than your salary will enable you to. I'm always yelling at my immigrant friends. I have a lot of immigrant friends who just don't understand the financial system. And so they put their money under the mattress or they save it in a bank account. And you know, how long is it going to take them to save money to buy a house? A long time. So I have one friend who says, well, you know, I want to get a loan. I said, well, how much, what's your salary that you declare into the federal government? He said, no, I don't declare money to the federal government. I make money under the table. I said, well, you don't have any credit then. You can't show someone that you're a good credit risk unless you file your taxes with the government. So you think you're saving money by not paying your taxes, but by not paying your taxes, you are destroying your credit and no one's going to lend you money. Why did Mr. Pariante buy 6 houses?
Yeah, good
Had
credit.
very good credit. Everybody loves to lend Mr. Pariante money because I always pay. That's why they like. They jump over each other to get me to lend me money. So being good credit is exactly how you increase wealth, and Hamilton knew that. And unfortunately, my immigrant friends have not learned that yet. And so they will. Eventually, as they become more Americanized, they'll realize credit and paying taxes is part of how you get ahead, by being a regular citizen, paying your taxes, establishing credit, and then borrowing. Okay, so that's the plan. The National Bank created the evolution of parties. What are the names of the 2 parties that fought over the National Bank? What was Hamilton's party called that favored the
The
bank?
Federalists,
The Federalists. And what was Jefferson's party that opposed the bank?
the Jeffersonians.
The Jeffersonian Republicans. You have the Federalists and Republicans, not to be confused with the Federalists and Anti-Federalists that we just mentioned, okay? And of course, Jefferson uses the 10th Amendment to say Hamilton can't create the bank, and Hamilton uses the Elastic Clause to claim that the federal government has the power to create the bank. Question?
Yeah, are the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans just completely independent from the Federalists and Anti-Federalists?
Completely independent. Don't even think they're connected.
Okay, no, but it's like one of them a subset of,
No. For example, James Madison wrote the Federalist Papers. So he was a Federalist with a small f, favoring the Constitution. But when the two parties split over the bank, whose side did he support? Hamilton or Jefferson? Jefferson. He became a Republican. Patrick Henry was an anti-Federalist. He wanted small government. But when the bank issue came up, which side did he support? Hamilton. He became a Federalist. So there is no connection between the factions over the, it's one of the biggest things I try to drill into your head. Do not carry over the fight over the Constitution into the first party system that got created over the National Bank. People switched sides depending on whether they followed Jefferson and his party or Hamilton and his. John Adams joined Hamilton's party and he became the next president. There are a few things there. I won't go over Jay's treaty, farewell address, Washington's farewell address. Adams basically would, please know a little bit about the XYZ affair. It would lead to an American ambassador being shunned by the French, leads to a 2-year undeclared war that Adams eventually solves with the Convention of 1800. In the meantime, his Federalists become very popular. He passes the Alien and Sedition Act, which is an attempt to eliminate free speech by the Jeffersonian Republicans. Jefferson opposes the Sedition Act and writes what paper? Basically nullifying it.
The Virginia
And Kentucky
resolution.
Very good. So Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolution saying that a state can nullify a law that is unconstitutional. That would be very different than Marbury versus Madison, which you see is the big underlying case that occurs under Jefferson, in which John Marshall, the head of the Supreme Court, says, who gets to declare laws unconstitutional? The states? Only the Supreme Court. What do you call that power by which the court can review federal laws and declare them unconstitutional? Judicial review, right. So always counterbalance. Nullification means the states can review federal laws, and judicial review means only the federal courts can review federal and state laws. Okay? Chase impeachment trial with Jefferson's attempt to impeach a Federalist judge, it failed. Louisiana Purchase, his greatest act as president, was doubling the size of the country in 1803. He successfully reduced the debt. He created a small navy. Jefferson was wildly popular after a very successful and prosperous first term, but he was equally as unpopular in his second term, largely because of the embargo. As the Napoleonic Wars, meaning the French Revolution, settled into a war of attrition between England and France, Jefferson tried to fight off the forces that were confiscating our cargo and impressing our seamen. So he established an embargo, which meant that no American ships could trade with Europe. And European ships, if they wanted to, ships could trade with us, but they would have to literally bring their products to America, sell them, and then leave without anything on them, which made it very expensive, and most European companies would not finance a voyage where they had to bring things, sell them, and then return empty hulled without anything in it. So the result was the embargo was very, very harmful, particularly to the American economy, because a lot of American farmers could not export their crops.
So the embargo is kind of like the opposite of the cash and carry idea?
Yes, exactly. In cash and carry, they bring nothing in and carry our exports out. In the embargo, they bring things in and can't carry anything out. Exactly right. So it's the direct opposite of cash and carry. Good. Okay. And it did have one side effect that was positive. Anybody remember what that was?
It made us make our own things.
Yes, what do you call that, when you make your own things?
Manufacturing.
Manufacturing, it spurred on American manufacturing. So you had the very ironic twist that after Hamilton is dead and Jefferson's political career is over, who really gets credit for creating American manufacturing, which was the darling hope of Alexander Hamilton?
Jefferson.
Jefferson, his embargo, did more to create lively American manufacturing than all of Hamilton's policies. So Jefferson wound up creating a lot of manufacturing because all those goods, rather than rot, would be manufactured into goods by Americans and sold domestically in the American market.
And didn't Jefferson want like farmers? He predicted.
Yes, he
like,
predicted a farming country, and he unintentionally spurred on manufacturing. I mean, he still favored farming, and please don't exaggerate. We didn't all of a sudden become this manufacturing powerhouse under Jefferson. It began sort of a baby manufacturing industry. But under Jefferson, the country was still 85% agricultural. And the shift would really remain agricultural through the American Civil War. When would we become primarily an industrial manufacturing country?
The Industrial Revolution.
Yes, and when was the Industrial Revolution?
1860.
Late 1800s, the Gilded Age. So between 1865, the end of the Civil War, and 1896, the election of McKinley. And that's why McKinley won, right? Because he was the candidate that represented
The big business.
business and the cities. He got all the city votes, and William Jennings Bryan got all the farming votes. So by 1896, farmers didn't have it. Only 35% of the country were farmers. So they couldn't win an election anymore. Whereas with Andrew Jackson, he had the farmers, and he won by landslides. Why?
Because they were the majority.
They were the huge majority in Jackson's day. But by William McKinley, they no longer were. Okay, administration of James Madison, that leads to the War of 1812. War of 1812 was probably the worst fought war in American history. We really should have lost the war, but what event happened at the very end of the war that skewed Americans' ideas on the war, kind of gave them a sense of victory and pride?
New Orleans.
New Orleans. Jackson's victory at New Orleans made Jackson a political hero and a future president, and it also convinced Americans they had thrashed the British. A group of Federalists had just, meanwhile, traveled down to Washington, D.C. to object to the war, claiming that it was a Jeffersonian plot to thwart and to kill off trade in New England. What group was that? Thank you, Yasmin. What group was that? What was the name of the group that came from New England down to, you remember, Yasmin?
I'm not saying.
Oh, that came down from New England down to Washington, D.C. and said, we want Congress to pass these amendments to never drag us into a war again unless we have 2/3 of the vote. Never have another embargo unless we have 2/3 of the vote.
The Hartford.
The Hartford Convention, yes, it's on the list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Hartford Convention really marks the end of the Federalist Party. And then you turn the page, we have James Monroe and John Quincy Adams. This is the era of good feelings. It's also the era of the rise of nationalism. In many ways, although the War of 1812 ended in an armistice stalemate, it launched a period of American nationalism because of Jackson's victory and because of the death of the Federalist Party. There was only one party, the Jeffersonian Republicans reigned supreme. They became a more national party. They were no longer just the party of farmers. They became the party also of manufacturers, which is why they passed and favored a high tariff. You had Henry Clay, who had his American system. It's not down here, but American system basically favored what? Manufacturing, tariffs, roads, favored business.
National Bank.
National Bank, exactly. So all of the Hamilton policies got picked up by the Jeffersonian Republicans under the banner of Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. They became known as National Republicans. Strong, pro-national, pro-federal Republicans. Meanwhile, another wing of the Republican Party sort of retained Jefferson's small farmer approach. And they would be led by what person? Who favored states' rights and farmer rights? Jackson, yeah. So Jackson would be representing the other wing, and eventually they would split. I put down here Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the golden age of American diplomacy. Don't forget those things. There's a bunch of treaties, including the Florida Purchase Treaty, the Rush-Bagot Treaty. They're all down there from your notebook. You should know them. And of course, the Missouri Compromise was sort of an ugly division of the country between slave states and free states. First time that occurred, so know that too. The election of 1824 is critical. It's a controversial election because nobody wins it. And what happens if none of the candidates win a majority of the electoral votes?
The
Speaker of the House.
The House of Representatives decides. Okay. The House of Representatives decides, and the House of Representatives takes a vote. Now, according to the Constitution, the House can only vote among the top 3 candidates. Of the 4 candidates listed there, who came in fourth and therefore was ineligible? Clay. But he was the Speaker of the House. See, this is what Clay's first of many losses as the president. But he gets to be the kingmaker. He gets to decide who's going to be president. So he throws his support behind John Quincy Adams. Why? What is Adams promising?
He's gonna give him a certain spot.
They're going to make him Secretary of State, exactly. So Henry Clay gets the prime position of Secretary of State, which is sort of the stepping stone to the presidency. John Quincy Adams becomes president, and who cries foul? Because he didn't win the majority, but he got more votes than the other 3 guys and thought he should have been chosen.
Jackson.
So Jackson breaks away, forms the Democratic Party. He finds a willing accomplice in Martin Van Buren, who had a similar party in New York called the Albany Regency. And Van Buren's Albany Regency and Jackson's breakaway party now form what are known as the Democratic Party. Okay, Democrat was a dirty word before this. Nobody believed that everybody should vote. They believed that women were stupid, blacks were slaves, and most poor whites that didn't own property were lazy and shouldn't own land. So the only people who voted prior to Andrew Jackson was who?
Wealthy white people.
Wealthy, landowning, white men. That's it.
What was that election called again?
The corrupt bargain election? Because Jackson accused John Quincy Adams and Clay of a corrupt bargain. So what happened is a new system is born, and you have a 2-party system, the Democrats and the National Republicans. And the National Republicans will eventually change their name to the
Republicans. Oh.
Whigs.
The Whigs, yes, the Whigs. They will oppose King Andrew. Okay, that leads us into the Jacksonian era. Good, we're doing great here on time. The Jacksonian era, Andrew Jackson will run against John Quincy Adams 4 years later. In many ways, Jackson won by a landslide because John Quincy Adams didn't quite get the new 2-party system. He was the last of the old-fashioned presidents that were selected by groups of politicians who nominated the sort of leading son from the state. There was no people voting for Washington or Adams or Jefferson or Madison or Monroe. And so the man who represented the people's candidate was who? Jackson. Jackson was the one who pushed for and advocated popular democratic politics. Many people feared that, including Jefferson. Jefferson thought Jackson was a lunatic. He was an anger and fearmonger. And he was greatly worried that the popular general might win the White House and tear apart the country, bring in all his hillbillies into the cabinet. And so Jackson ran, he won the presidency, and many, many people feared a Jackson victory. Jefferson fortunately died before that day came. He died in 1826 on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, along with John Adams. And so Jefferson never lived to see the day that Jackson became president. He probably would have cried if he had lived to see it. But Jackson did become president, and Jackson proved to be far more able a president than people gave him credit. We talked about the Peggy Eaton affair. Jackson's policy with Indians, of course, has been widely criticized, particularly what event
Trail
the Trail of Tears and his Indian Removal Act. However, despite the fact that Jackson favored states' rights, he did believe in a strong federal government, and that nothing showed that off more than the tariff of 1832 and that controversy. Basically, South Carolina nullified the tariff of 1832, despite the fact that it was actually a lowering of what earlier tariff? The tariff of,
Oh,
Abomination.
tariff of, begins with an A.
Abomination.
Yeah, so you're doing AP review.
Okay.
Tariff of abominations. So, the tariff of abominations was 45%, the tariff of 1832 was 35%, and South Carolina didn't like it. They thought it was still too high, so what did they do? They nullified it. This led to a controversy. South Carolina refused to collect the tariff revenue in their state. Jackson collected together a 30,000-man army and said, we're going to go down there and collect the tariff revenue by force. So it looked like a civil war was going to brew. John C. Calhoun, the leader of South Carolina, and by now a political enemy of Andrew Jackson, after having served as his vice president in his first term, John C. Calhoun basically says, no, we reserve the right to nullify laws within our borders. The day is saved by, once again, Henry Clay. He engineers a third tariff, the tariff of 1833, that lowers it again even 10% more to 25%. Jackson continues his ways of being a strong president by vetoing the bank. Clay thought that would win him the presidency, but in fact, Jackson so successfully demonized the bank and put all the money from the national bank where?
to
Pet
Pet
banks.
banks.
Pet banks, private banks and state banks, and of course, what did those private banks and state banks do with all the money?
Overloaned it.
They overloaned it, right? They loaned it out, created inflation over speculation, which would lead to the Panic of 1837, which fortunately did not occur under Andrew Jackson, but unfortunately for his friend and successor, broke out just as Martin Van Buren took office. He was a very able president. He established the Independent Treasury Bill, which established a sort of system of vaults to take money out of circulation to stop over speculation. Unfortunately, though, Van Buren's act saved the economy, but not quickly enough to win him a second term. So the result was he was then defeated by William Henry Harrison, old Tippacanoe. Finally, the Whigs, who had lost with John Quincy Adams, with Henry Clay, and with Henry Clay again, finally will dump Henry Clay, and they'll make William Henry Harrison the candidate, and he wins. And so Harrison becomes president. He dies after 1 month in office, and all of a sudden John Tyler becomes president. Remember, a Democrat in Whig's clothing. Remember that? So Tyler kind of acts like a Democrat. He vetoes the bank again. He vetoes the tariff. And poor Clay is frustrated that he can't get an honest Whig with strong national policies in, and Manifest Destiny becomes the issue of the 1840s.
Just kidding.
No? Okay. Okay, let's see. Let's call it there. We accomplished our objective of getting through the Jackson era. So what we're going to do is next Thursday, I'll cover Manifest Destiny and the entire next page through Reconstruction, okay? Yes.
Sorry. Who was the person that told Jackson not to take pictures down to the South Carolina?
Clay. Yeah, Clay said, don't do that, I'll negotiate a compromise. He also didn't want Jackson to gain more fame and popularity by confronting the South Carolinians and defeating them. So it was also for his own political gain, but it was also for patriotic reasons. Yes?
How much of this text is essay, like